On the morning of April 25, 1644, the last emperor of China walked alone to a small hill just north of the Forbidden City. He had spent the night killing members of his own family. He had rung the great palace bell, the bell that by ancient custom summoned the court to audience, and no minister had answered. The bell had echoed through the empty palace corridors for a long time, and then gone silent. He was 33 years old, and he had been trying to save his dynasty for 17 years. He found a locust tree on the hill. He used the silk sash of his imperial robe to hang himself. The Ming Dynasty, which had ruled China for 276 years, died with him on that hill. This is the story of how that happened. It is the story of an emperor who genuinely wanted to save his dynasty, who worked harder than almost any of his predecessors, and who destroyed it anyway, because he spent 17 years eating the shepherds one by one, and when the wolf finally arrived, there was no one left who was willing to stand between them. Before we understand the fall, we need to understand what was falling. The Ming Dynasty was not a failing state at its height. It was one of the great achievements of human organization. When Zhu Yuanzhang founded it in 1368, he was doing something historically extraordinary. He was a man born in such absolute poverty that his family could not afford proper burial for relatives who died of famine, a man who had survived by begging as a wandering monk, who had led a peasant rebellion, overthrown the Mongol Yuan dynasty, and made himself the son of heaven. The dynasty he founded gave China more than 2 centuries of relative stability, administered from the Forbidden City in Beijing, the largest palace complex ever built by human beings, its 9,000 rooms housing a civilization of breathtaking sophistication. The Ming rebuilt the Great Wall in the brick-and-mortar forms we recognize today. The Ming sent the Zheng expeditions across the Indian Ocean as far as East Africa, the largest naval force the world had yet seen. The population of China under the Ming numbered perhaps 160 million souls, more than all of Europe combined. This was the inheritance that Chongzhen received when he took the throne in 1627 at the age of 16. But that is the inheritance on paper. The actual empire that Chongzhen received was something else entirely. His brother, the Tianqi Emperor, had reigned for 7 years and spent most of that time in his carpentry workshop. The Tianqi Emperor was, by all accounts, genuinely talented with wood. He could build intricate furniture and lacquered objects of real craftsmanship. He was also almost completely uninterested in governance, and he had found what seemed to him a perfect solution to his lack of interest. He had allowed a eunuch named Wei Zhongxian to run the empire in his name. Wei Zhongxian was not a minor court functionary. He was, by the mid-1620s, the most powerful person in China who was not technically the emperor. He had temples built to himself while he still lived, a sacrilege so astonishing that even his contemporaries could barely process it. He had systematically purged the Donglan Academy, the network of reform-minded scholar officials who had been trying to address the empire's structural problems, the fiscal crisis, the corruption in the provincial governments, the deteriorating military capacity. He had them imprisoned, tortured, and killed. By the time the Tianqi Emperor died in 1627, the court that Chongzhen inherited was staffed substantially by men who had survived Wei Zhongxian's purges by being useful to Wei Zhongxian, not by being good at their jobs. Chongzhen's first act of government gave everyone reason to hope. Within months of taking the throne at 16, he had systematically dismantled the Wei Zhongxian network. He moved with precision, compiling evidence, building cases, acting decisively. Wei Zhongxian himself recognized what was happening and committed suicide before he could be arrested. His chief allies were purged, demoted, or executed. His temples were demolished. The list of charges compiled against him ran to thousands of items. It was a clean, efficient, well-executed piece of political surgery performed by a teenager. If you were watching the Chinese court in late 1627 and early 1628, you might reasonably have concluded that an unusually capable emperor had arrived, and that the dynasty's troubles were about to be addressed with the clarity and determination that had been lacking under the carpentry-loving Tianqi Emperor. What could not yet be seen was the lesson Chongzhen had drawn from what he had witnessed and what he had destroyed. He had learned that powerful men betray emperors. He had learned that trusted officials form factions. He had learned that the court was full of enemies. He had absorbed those lessons completely, and he would spend the rest of his reign applying them, with results that proved more catastrophic than Wei Zhongxian's original treachery. To understand why Chongzhen failed, you have to understand the 3 simultaneous crises he was managing, because any one of them alone might have destroyed the dynasty. The first was the Manchu threat from the northeast. Nurhaci, a chieftain of the Jurchen people, the same ethnic group that had founded an earlier dynasty in northern China centuries before, had spent the early 17th century unifying the Jurchen tribes under a military system of extraordinary discipline and effectiveness. He called his state the later Jin and spent a decade systematically defeating Ming armies and seizing Ming territory in Manchuria. He died in 1626, reportedly wounded by Ming artillery during an unsuccessful assault on the fortress at Ningyuan, a defeat that stung him badly. His successor was his son Hong Taiji, who proved to be an even more formidable leader. Hong Taiji reorganized the Manchu military system, added Chinese artillery units and Chinese administrative advisors to his government, established relationships with Mongolian tribes to secure his flanks, and in 1636 renamed his dynasty the King, signaling his intention to eventually rule all of China. The second crisis was internal, driven by something that no emperor could have controlled, the climate. The period historians now call the Little Ice Age had brought a generation of unusual cold and drought to northern China. Temperatures fell across the northern hemisphere in ways that disrupted agriculture at precisely the scale needed to be catastrophic. In Shaanxi province, in Shaanxi, in Hainan, the heartland of northern China, the harvests failed year after year through the 1630s. Locust swarms swept across the landscape, devouring what little had survived the drought. Millions of people starved. And when millions of people starve and the government cannot feed them or protect them, they eventually stop waiting for salvation from above and start taking what they need by force. The peasant rebellions that erupted across northern China in this period were not ideological movements in any sophisticated sense. They were hunger made violent. The man who would lead the most significant of these rebellions had been a government postal worker. His name was Li Zicheng, and when the Ming's budget crisis eliminated his position, he had nothing left to lose. He joined a rebellion in Shaanxi, proved a gifted military commander, survived multiple near defeats that would have finished lesser men, and by the early 1640s commanded an army of hundreds of thousands drawn from the starving and desperate poor of northern China. The third crisis was fiscal, and it was in some ways the most fundamental because it made both of the others impossible to solve. The Ming state was, by the 1630s, essentially bankrupt. The flow of silver that had funded the Chinese economy and paid for Ming governance, silver that arrived from the Americas via Spanish trading ships in Manila, silver from Japanese mines through Nagasaki, had sharply contracted. Global trade disruptions, wars in Europe and the Americas, changes in Japanese economic policy, all of these reduced the silver supply just as the Ming needed it most. Tax revenues had collapsed in the famine-struck provinces even as the cost of maintaining the northeastern frontier and suppressing internal rebellions was rising. Soldiers went unpaid for months at the northeastern garrisons. When soldiers went unpaid long enough, they deserted. When border garrisons deserted, the frontier weakened. When the frontier weakened, Manchu raids reached deeper into China. The raids disrupted agriculture in new provinces, which reduced tax revenues further, which made it harder to pay the soldiers, which led to more desertions. It was a loop that Chongzhen could see clearly and could not break. What makes Chongzhen's tragedy so painful to study is that he was genuinely trying. He was not the dissipated emperor who handed his empire to a favorite. He held court regularly. He reviewed the official reports and recommendations from his governors and ministers with real attention. He fasted during natural disasters as a sign of imperial repentance, following a Confucian tradition that attributed heaven-sent calamities to the moral failings of the ruler. He worked late into the night when the crises were most acute. He was personally frugal to a degree that was remarkable for someone who lived inside the Forbidden City. Court records describe him repairing his own clothing rather than ordering new imperial robes when the treasury was bare. He genuinely cared about the fate of the dynasty and the welfare of his people. And he also had, according to virtually every historian who has studied his reign, catastrophically poor judgment about the people around him, specifically an inability to trust anyone for long enough to let them do their jobs. The numbers are damning. In 17 years as emperor, Chongzhen went through more than 50 chief grand secretaries, the officials who would today be called prime ministers, the men responsible for managing the daily operations of the government. More than 50 in 17 years. That averages roughly one every 4 months. He dismissed or demoted hundreds of provincial governors and military commanders. He executed at least 11 military commanders on charges that included treason, cowardice, and dereliction. The pattern was always the same. An official would be appointed, would seem promising, would face a crisis, would make a decision that went wrong or could be blamed on them, and would be dismissed, demoted, or executed. The next official would take over knowing exactly what had happened to his predecessor. Over time, capable and ambitious men learned that accepting a high appointment from the Chongzhen emperor was a fast path to ruin, and they found ways to avoid it. The posts filled with whoever was left, men who had learned that the safest strategy was to avoid decisive action, to spread blame laterally when things went wrong, and to protect themselves politically rather than actually govern. Chongzhen cried wolf so many times that eventually the men who were not wolves at all, his most capable officials, had all been consumed. What remained were men who had learned how to look harmless. The name Yuan Chonghuan stands at the center of this failure, the way a wound stands at the center of an infection. He was the best military commander the Ming produced in the final generation of its existence. He was not an easy man. He was imperious, confident to the edge of arrogance, operating with a degree of independent authority that made emperors nervous in the way that genuinely capable subordinates always make insecure superiors nervous. But he understood the Manchu military system, the banner system that organized Manchu soldiers by unit affiliation rather than regional origin, the cavalry tactics that made Manchu armies terrifyingly mobile, the strategic logic that sought always to create situations where superior mobility could be exploited. He had beaten Nurhaci. In 1626, when the great Manchu leader had brought his army against the fortress of Ningyuan, Yuan Chonghuan had held the walls and inflicted on Nurhaci the first significant defeat he had suffered in nearly a decade. It was a victory built on careful preparation. Yuan Chonghuan had obtained European-style cannon, trained his men to use them, fortified the walls with an engineer's attention to fields of fire. Nurhaci withdrew and died months later. For a brief moment, the frontier held. Yuan Chonghuan then rebuilt the Ming defensive system along the Liaodong corridor, the strip of territory connecting Beijing to the northeast, with systematic intelligence about Manchu movements, a chain of fortified positions, and careful management of the local military population. He was given broad authority to manage the northeast with minimal interference from Beijing. And then, in 1629, Taiji executed one of the most brilliant strategic moves in Chinese military history. Rather than attacking Yuan Chonghuan's prepared defenses directly, those walls with their European guns, those fortified positions with their interlocking fields of fire, he simply went around them. He led his army in a great arc around the western end of the Great Wall through Inner Mongolia and struck directly at Beijing from the northwest. The wall was supposed to keep the Manchus out. Taiji had simply bypassed the defended sections entirely. The capital was suddenly under attack from a direction that all of Yuan Chonghuan's preparations had not anticipated. Yuan Chonghuan's response to this crisis showed exactly what he was. He received the news of the Manchu approach and marched his army south at maximum speed, racing from the northeastern frontier toward Beijing, covering hundreds of miles in days. He arrived at the outskirts of the capital before Taiji could reach the walls, positioned his force between the Manchu army and the city, and fought a defensive battle that stopped the attack. He had effectively saved Beijing. He camped his army outside the city walls, waiting for an opportunity to drive the Manchus back. From inside the city, he could be seen as a savior. From inside Taiji's headquarters, he was a problem that needed to be removed by other means. Taiji had been preparing for exactly this kind of situation. He knew that Chongzhen was suspicious of Yuan Chonghuan, suspicious of his independent authority, suspicious of the fact that Yuan Chonghuan had conducted negotiations with the Manchus, conversations that the court had authorized, but that looked, to a mind primed for betrayal, like something more sinister. Taiji arranged for a piece of theater. He had 2 Chinese eunuchs, men who had been captured during the Manchu campaign, placed in a position where they could overhear a conversation between Manchu officers. The conversation was fictional, performed for an audience of 2. It suggested that the entire Beijing campaign had been coordinated in advance between Yuan Chonghuan and the Manchu command, that Yuan Chonghuan had allowed the army to approach the capital deliberately as part of an arrangement with the enemy. Then Taiji arranged for these eunuchs to escape. He let them get away. They walked back to Beijing carrying this invented intelligence. They went directly to the emperor's officials and reported what they had heard. The reports made their way to Chongzhen. He believed it. The man who had just raced hundreds of miles to save Beijing, who was camping his army outside the city walls at that very moment to protect it, was arrested. Yuan Chonghuan was dragged from a meeting with the emperor, hauled before a court that would not seriously question the evidence against him, and imprisoned. 9 months later, in September 1630, he was executed by Lingchai, death by 1,000 cuts, one of the most agonizing methods of execution in Chinese practice. The executioner removed slices of flesh from his body in a prescribed sequence over an extended period, and Yuan Chonghuan died maintaining, to the last, that he was innocent. The crowd that had been told he was a traitor who had sold out Beijing reportedly tore pieces of his flesh from the execution ground and ate them. That is how much the people of Beijing hated the man who had saved them, because Chongzhen had told them he was a traitor and they had believed it. The execution of Yuan Chonghuan in 1630 is the hinge on which the dynasty's fate turned. It was not the only cause of what followed. The structural problems were real and deep, and they predated Chongzhen and Yuan Chonghuan both. But the execution removed the one commander who had demonstrated the ability to hold the northeastern frontier against the king, and it sent a message to every other capable man in the empire. If Yuan Chonghuan can be executed for treason after winning at Ningyuan and saving Beijing, then no achievement is safe, and no loyalty is rewarded. After 1630, the northeastern commands went to men who had learned from Yuan Chonghuan's fate. They would not commit. They would not take the kind of decisive, independent action that might be misinterpreted as the kind of independence that had gotten Yuan Chonghuan killed. They would hedge and protect themselves politically and let the Qing consolidate and grow stronger year by year. And Chongzhen would dismiss them or execute them for failing to hold the frontier, never quite understanding that he had made it impossible for any honest man to hold it. The 1630s were a decade in which everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and the responses to each disaster undermined the capacity to respond to the next. The famine in Shaanxi that had launched Li Zicheng's rebellion spread to Henan and beyond. Government campaigns against the rebel forces came close to success more than once, and then Chongzhen would dismiss or execute the commander at the critical moment, either because he suspected them of something or because a political faction at court had accused them of something, and Li Zicheng would survive to rebuild and expand. A commander named Hong Chengchou managed to stabilize some of the northeast, and was then drawn into a catastrophic engagement at Zhongxian in 1642 that ended with his capture by the king. He eventually defected, and his knowledge of Ming military dispositions was invaluable to the enemy. A commander named Sun Chuanting managed multiple successful campaigns against Li Zicheng before being executed by Chongzhen after a political dispute. Each execution, each dismissal, consumed more of the irreplaceable supply of experienced military leadership and replaced it with whoever was left, men who might be loyal but were not effective, or men who had learned to be invisible rather than useful. By 1643, Li Zicheng had conquered most of Shanxi and large portions of Henan and Hubei. His army numbered hundreds of thousands. His administrative system, while crude, was functioning well enough to hold the territory he had taken. In January 1644, he declared the founding of the Shun Dynasty and proclaimed himself emperor. Then he began marching north toward Beijing. The speed of the advance was stunning. Ming garrisons along the route either defected en masse, officers calculating that Li Zicheng's forces were the likely winners and adjusting their loyalties accordingly, or simply melted away. Soldiers who had not been paid in months declining to die for a government that had forgotten them. By the end of March 1644, Li Zicheng's forces were approaching the outskirts of the capital. Chongzhen had been emperor for 17 years. He had devoted those 17 years to saving the dynasty. And the dynasty was about to end. The final weeks in Beijing were a kind of extended nightmare in which every decision Chongzhen made was wrong, and the men around him were either too afraid or too self-interested to tell him so. He called for emergency donations to fund the defense of the capital. He appealed to his relatives, the imperial princes, the wealthy families of the capital, to contribute money for soldiers and supplies. He raised almost nothing. The wealthy of Beijing had been watching his government long enough to understand that contributing to its survival was a poor investment, and they were quietly making arrangements for whatever came next. He called for military volunteers to step forward and lead the defense. Almost no one answered. He considered the option that might actually have saved him, retreating south to Nanjing, the southern capital, where Ming institutions still functioned and where a court in exile could continue the dynasty for years, perhaps decades, even if Beijing fell. His ministers debated this option and then told him not to go. Moving south would look like abandoning the capital. A true emperor dies defending his realm. A loyal minister does not advise his ruler to flee. The advice was correct by the standards of Confucian political philosophy and catastrophically wrong as military strategy. Chongzhen stayed. On the night of April 24th, 1644, as Li Zicheng's forces breached the outer fortifications of Beijing, Chongzhen moved through the Forbidden City, performing what he seems to have understood would be his final acts as emperor. He drank alone. He went to his concubines and issued orders for their deaths to prevent their capture and dishonor at the hands of the rebels. Some complied, some escaped in the confusion. He went to the imperial chambers where his daughters lived. He killed his youngest daughter himself. He found his eldest daughter, Princess Changping, and struck her with his sword, severing her arm. She survived, fell unconscious, and lived long enough to become one of the most poignant figures in Chinese cultural memory, the princess with the severed arm who outlived the dynasty that bore her. He found his sons and told them to disguise themselves in commoners' clothes and flee into the city. He never saw any of them again. In the morning of April 25th, Chongzhen put on his imperial robes. He walked to the great bell that hung in the palace complex, the bell whose ringing had for generations summoned the ministers of state to audience with the Son of Heaven. He struck the bell. The sound went out across the Forbidden City. He waited. No minister came. He rang it again. The corridors remained empty. The men who had advised him, who had been summoned from their beds at all hours to discuss the crises of his reign, who had accused each other before him and plotted against each other in his name, who had watched him execute 50 prime ministers and 11 military commanders, those men had made their calculations about this morning and had decided they would not be present for it. Some were already in hiding. Some were already negotiating with Li Zicheng's emissaries. Some had simply concluded that there was no longer any point. Chongzhen was dressed in white, the color of mourning. A single eunuch named Wang remained at his side. Wang, who had served the emperor for years, who held no power and no rank worth protecting, who had no calculation left to make, was there. They walked together to Jingshan, the artificial hill just north of the Forbidden City, the coal hill built from the earth excavated for the palace moat, the little elevation from which you can see the golden rooftops of the Forbidden City stretching away to the south. Chongzhen climbed the hill. He was 33 years old. He had tried. He wrote his final note on the lining of his imperial robe. The text has been preserved in multiple independent sources. It reads, "I, feeble and of small virtue, have offended against heaven. The rebels have seized my capital because my ministers deceived me. Ashamed to face my ancestors, I die. Removing my imperial cap, with my hair disheveled about my face, I leave to the rebels the dismemberment of my body. Let them not harm my people." He removed his crown. He loosened his hair so that it fell over his face, the traditional posture of shame, covering himself so that he could not look upon the ruin he had made. He used the sash of his imperial robe to hang himself from the locust tree. Wang Cheng'en, the loyal eunuch, hung himself from another tree nearby. When Li Zicheng's soldiers found them, they were together on the hill, the emperor and his servant, the last two men of the Ming court who had shown up when the bell rang. Li Zicheng treated the body with a certain respect, or at least avoided spectacular desecration. A rebel emperor establishing a new dynasty needed some appearance of legitimacy, and defiling the previous ruler's corpse was not the image he wanted to project. Chongzhen and his empress were given temporary burial in a Ming imperial tomb. Later, after Li Zicheng himself was driven from Beijing and killed, the Qing dynasty that replaced him would provide proper imperial burial and maintain the tomb. They could afford generosity. The Qing conquest of China used a particular legitimizing story. They had not come to conquer China, they said. They had come to avenge the Ming emperor murdered by the rebel Li Zicheng. They were restoring order, punishing the rebels who had destroyed the legitimate dynasty. This framing, that the Qing were the avengers of the Ming emperor rather than his successors by conquest, allowed a Manchu dynasty to present itself as the continuation of Chinese civilization rather than its replacement. In this final way, even after his death, Chongzhen was used for purposes he could not have anticipated and would not have chosen. Wu Sanggui's decision deserves its own moment in this accounting. He was the Ming general commanding the garrison at Shanhaiguan, the Shanhai Pass, the fortified gateway through the Great Wall where the wall meets the Bohai Sea, the narrow choke point through which any invasion of China from the northeast must pass. He commanded approximately 100,000 soldiers, the best equipped and most disciplined remaining military force loyal to the Ming. When Li Zicheng took Beijing, Wu Songui was on the march south to relieve the capital. He turned back when he heard that Beijing had fallen and the emperor was dead. He could have submitted to Li Zicheng, the new ruler of the capital, and retained his position. He almost did, but Li Zicheng's forces had seized his family in Beijing and treated them badly, and had taken his famous concubine Chen Yuan, whose beauty had been celebrated in poetry across the empire. And more prosaically, Wu Songui was a professional soldier who could assess military situations. Li Zicheng's army had taken a capital city. The Qing forces were disciplined, experienced, and had been building strength for a generation. Wu Songui opened the gate at Shanhai Pass and invited the Manchu army in. The combined force drove Li Zicheng out of Beijing within weeks. Li Zicheng fled west and was eventually killed by local militia in Hubei. The Qing emperor was installed in the Forbidden City. The dynasty that would rule China for the next 268 years had begun. The question that historians return to again and again is whether any of this was avoidable. Could Chongzhen have saved the Ming dynasty, or was the situation he inherited simply impossible? The honest answer is probably impossible to save fully, but not impossible to extend, and the extension might have mattered. The structural problems, the fiscal collapse, the climate crisis, the accumulated weakness of decades of mismanagement predated him and ran deeper than any individual could easily fix. But the execution of Yuan Chonghuan in 1630 demonstrably changed the trajectory of the northeastern frontier, removing the one commander who had shown he could hold it. The destruction of 50 prime ministers demonstrably eliminated the institutional capacity to respond to compound crises. And the decision to stay in Beijing rather than relocate the court to Nanjing sealed the personal fate of the dynasty's last legitimate ruler in a way that was not inevitable. A southern Ming court maintained resistance for nearly 2 decades after 1644. Whether it could have ultimately prevailed against the Qing is doubtful, but 2 decades is not nothing, and history is full of dynasties that survived through southern exile long enough to change the outcome. The judgment on Chongzhen that has persisted through the centuries since his death is a strange and complicated one, because it requires holding 2 contradictory assessments simultaneously. He was a good man. He was a bad emperor. He worked harder than most rulers would have worked in his position. His judgment was worse than almost any ruler in his position could afford. He deserved, perhaps, a different life. A smaller stage, a domain where his earnestness could not be amplified by imperial power into catastrophe on a civilizational scale. He deserved, at minimum, advisors who were honest with him, and he had spent 17 years systematically eliminating the honest ones. The Qing historians who compiled the official Ming history treated him with more sympathy than their predecessors in previous dynasty transition histories had typically shown to fallen rulers. They acknowledged that he was personally virtuous, that he was personally courageous, and that the dynasty's fall was not primarily the result of his personal failings, but of the failings of the system he had inherited and been unable to reform. The critique that emerges from those same records, damning precisely because it is so measured, is that his specific decisions made the impossible even more impossible, and that a man of better judgment, facing the same inherited problems, might at least have bought the dynasty more time and spared more of his people. When the bell rang on the morning of April 25th, 1644, and no one came, the silence was not just political cowardice. It was the accumulated result of 17 years of erosion. Every minister who had been unjustly dismissed, every commander who had been executed for what his replacement would also fail to accomplish, every official who had learned that competence was dangerous and incompetence was survivable, all of them were present in that silence. Chongzhen had rung the wolf alarm so many times, for so many men who were not wolves, that when the real wolf stood at the gates of Beijing, the shepherds had all gone home. He understood this at the end. His final note did not blame his people. It did not blame the rebels. It blamed his ministers, the men who had deceived him, he said. Whether that framing was accurate or whether it was a final failure of self-knowledge is a question that each reader of his story has to answer for themselves. What is certain is that he wrote the words in his own blood, on his own robe, and then he covered his face with his hair so he would not have to look at what his reign had become, and he walked to the tree.